it is important that whatever we say in these videos, that you really check them out with the appropriate experts. Hey there, my name is Ernest Homeyer, and around the Adirondack Park region, they call me the philosopher bartender. So today's segment is going to introduce the history of beer, and we're going to focus on Scottish beers and some of the ancient recipes that they used. So let's talk a little bit about the beginning of beer. The beginning of beer goes back a long way. In fact, it goes back a real long way. In fact, it goes back so far that it goes back to the time of the Mesopotamians. And they've been finding archaeological digs of where they've been finding these original pots. And there are only really two types of beer in the world. There's a lot of different styles of beer, but really only two different types of beer. All beer has to either be an ale or a lager. In that style of beer, that's when you start talking about porters and stouts and hefeweizens and pilsners. But those are styles of beer. Every beer needs to come back to being either a ale or a lager. And the first beers that were made were ales. And that means that they were top-down beers or top-fermented, which, think about in those days, and think about those original historic people sitting around a campfire with these big belly pots, and they're putting all kinds of ingredients in, and that's how the first beer was made. They were made in very high temperatures or warm temperatures. They were tended to be warm when you drank them, tended to be bitter, and tended to not last very long. And so, believe it or not, those first beers also were really not made of a lot of barley, hops, or wheat. That came much later. The original beers were made from different ingredients. So, as we have been talking, the original beers were all ales. And what that meant was that they were top fermented. They had these huge pots or pits. They would boil a whole bunch of things underneath this roaring fire. They would use all natural ingredients around them and use all of the natural yeast in the air. Right. Well, I think you get the idea. So you may be wondering, why am I sitting in this pine tree talking about beer? Well, there's a common misperception that all beer originally was made out of barley, hops, and wheat. And those ingredients we use today. Well, come to find out, those early ales were anything but. They used things like pine trees. There is a cool Scots pine ale that the Scottish people used to do as part of their historic brewing processes, where they actually used elements of the pine tree to make their beer. This particular Scots pine ale, by the way, was introduced by the Vikings, who used spruce and pine, which were very popular in northern Scotland until the end of the 19th century. Can you imagine that? And here we always thought beer was made from barley and hops. So you may be thinking, what am I doing now collecting these plants? Well, in our ongoing discussion about these different beers, and they were not made from barley hops. They were made from plants, and they were made from herbs and spices. So this particular beer was made from heather flowers, and it's been brewed in Scotland since the year 2000 BC. Can you imagine a beer brewed that early? But that's a real indicator on how these beers were made from totally different ingredients than from today. Another beer that was made in Scotland was called the Edelberry Black Ale, which was made by the Druids since the 9th century. And what they did was they used edelberries to make beer, which was known at that time to have one of the highest properties of rich oils and fruit aroma. Now here's a trivia question for you. What does seaweed and beer have to do with one another? Well, in this opening discussion about historic beers, believe it or not, in Scotland, they took seaweed, and that's how they fertilized the barley to make the beer. And so this beer is called a Kelpie seaweed ale that is all brewed with natural flavors of where they spread seaweed, because obviously in Scotland seaweed is dominant as being an island, and they use that seaweed to fertilize the barley. Another example of how ancient grains, herbs, flowers, seaweed, pine trees, all were the natural ingredients they made to make those early beers.